Hello there, come in and get comfortable. Tonight we are turning our eyes toward the misty green outlines of the British Isles, a land where every stone, every castle ruin, and every winding road has a memory to share. But before we step onto those ancient shores, take a moment to adjust your pillows, pull the blanket up to your chin, and let your body sink deeper into the mattress. There is no rush here. There is nowhere else you need to be. If you enjoy drifting off to these quiet histories, please do gently click the like button and subscribe so you can join us for every journey. And if you like, leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It is a comforting thought to imagine us all sharing this quiet moment across the globe. Now, breathe in slowly, filling your chest with calm, and breathe out, letting go of any tension in your shoulders or your jaw. Just let it drift away. The day is done, and the noise of the world has faded, leaving only this quiet space. We are going to take a long, gentle journey backward, drifting through time like a boat floating down a very long, very slow river. We are going to explore the history of this small, rain-swept island in the North Atlantic, a place where stories have piled up like leaves on a forest floor for over 1600 years. This is the story of Britain, but not the noisy version full of dates to memorise. This is the quiet version, the feeling of the centuries passing, the landscape changing, and the people living their lives one sunrise at a time. So, close your eyes if you like, and imagine a timeline stretching out behind you, a long silver thread reaching back into the mist. When we think of history, we often think of books, of dusty libraries, of lists of kings and queens memorised for a school exam. But tonight I want you to think of history as a landscape. Imagine the island of Britain not as a map on a screen, but as a living, breathing entity, a giant rock anchored in the grey Atlantic, battered by winds and warmed by the Gulf Stream. It is a place of deep, ancient silence. Before the cities rose, before the engines roared, there was the sound of the wind in the heather, the cry of the gull, and the endless rhythmic beating of the waves against the chalk cliffs. This land has been here, watching, waiting, absorbing the lives of millions of people, layer upon layer, like sediment settling on a riverbed. It is a comforting thought, isn't it? To know that the ground beneath our feet, or the ground beneath the feet of those on that distant island, has held so many stories. It gives us a sense of perspective. Our current worries, the noise of our modern lives, are just a tiny flicker in the vast, slow timeline of the earth. We are part of a continuity, a long chain of human experience that stretches back into the shadows. Tonight, we are going to walk back down that chain. We are going to peel back the layers of the present day. We will gently lift away the skyscrapers of London, the tarmac of the motorways, the hum of the electrical grid. We will let the modern world dissolve like sugar in hot tea, leaving us with something older, quieter, and more mysterious. Imagine yourself standing on a high hill in the centre of the island. The air is cool and smells of rain and wet grass. Below you, the landscape stretches out, a patchwork of greens and browns, rolling hills, deep forests, and silver rivers winding their way to the sea. This is the stage upon which our story plays out. It is a stage that has seen tragedies and comedies, wars and weddings, but through it all, the land itself remains constant. The sun rises in the east, burning off the morning mist, and sets in the west, casting long shadows over the valleys. The seasons turn with a reassuring regularity. Spring brings the bluebells in the woods. Summer brings the long golden twilights. Autumn brings the turning of the leaves and the smell of wood smoke. And winter brings the frost that outlines every blade of grass in silver. This cycle has continued for thousands of years, a heartbeat that underpins everything we are about to explore. Let us drift back now, further and further. We are going back to a time before the island was called Britain, before it was called England, to a time when it was a mysterious edge of the known world. We are travelling back 2,000 years. The world is quieter here. There is no hum of traffic, no airplanes overhead. The silence is profound, broken only by the sounds of nature. The forests are deeper and darker, vast woodlands of oak and ash that cover much of the land, filled with wolves, bears, and wild boar. The people who live here are the Britons, a Celtic people living in round houses with thatched roofs, farming the small clearings, and telling stories of the gods who live in the rivers and the trees. But something is coming. Listen, can you hear it? It is a rhythmic sound, faint at first but growing steadier. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It is the sound of hobnailed sandals striking stone. The Romans are arriving. It is difficult to overstate the shock of this arrival. To the people of the Iron Age island, the Romans must have seemed like visitors from another planet. They arrived not just with swords, but with geometry. The Romans were obsessed with order. They looked at the wild, rolling, chaotic hills of Britannia and decided that what this place needed was a straight line. They brought with them the heavy weight of an empire that stretched from the sands of Syria to the moors of Scotland. They were engineers as much as they were soldiers. Imagine the construction of a Roman road. It was not a hasty affair. It was a meditation on permanence. First, the surveyors would stand on the hilltops, using their instruments to sight a line that was perfectly straight, ignoring the curves of the landscape. Then came the digging. The legions would dig down to the bedrock, laying a foundation of heavy stones, then layers of gravel, then sand, and finally large, smooth paving stones, cambered so the rain would run off into ditches on the side. They built these roads to last forever, and in a way they have. Watling Street, the Fosse Way, Ermine Street, these great arteries are still there. When you drive up the A5 today, or the A46, you're often driving directly on top of the work of men who lived and died 20 centuries ago. There is a deep, sleepy comfort in that realization. You are following in footsteps that have been marching for 2 millennia. The Romans didn't just build roads, they built a lifestyle. In the sheltered valleys of the Cotswolds and the south, they built villas. Close your eyes and picture one of these villas on a damp November evening. The rain is falling steadily outside, turning the British mud into a soup. But inside the villa it is warm. The Romans brought the technology of the hypocaust, underfloor heating. Hot air from a wood-fired furnace circulated through hollow spaces under the floor tiles and up through the walls. Imagine walking into that villa, taking off your wet cloak and your muddy sandals, and feeling the gentle, radiating heat rising up through the mosaic floor into the soles of your feet. It is a level of comfort that wouldn't be seen again on the island for another 1,000 years. These mosaics are still there, buried under the fields. Intricate pictures made of thousands of tiny coloured cubes of stone, tesserae, pictures of dolphins, of the seasons, of gods drinking wine. Think of the patience required to lay those floors. The artisan kneeling on the ground, placing each tiny stone by hand, hour after hour, creating a picture meant to last. It is a slow, deliberate kind of art. The Romans also brought the bathhouse, a place of steam and echo. Imagine the sound of water splashing against stone, the smell of scented oils, the murmur of Latin conversation drifting through the steam. It was a slice of the Mediterranean transplanted to the grey north. But empires are like the tide. They come in with great force, but eventually the water must retreat. By the early 5th century, the heart of the empire in Rome was failing. The order was given to withdraw. It wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but a slow drifting away. The legions marched to the ports. The administrators packed their scrolls and their seal rings. The ships set sail, disappearing over the horizon, and they didn't come back. The island was left alone. The villas were abandoned. Slowly the roofs began to leak. The tiles slipped one by one. The windows, once filled with greenish glass, broke. The wind blew the autumn leaves into the grand dining rooms. Moss began to grow on the mosaic floors. It is a poignant, melancholic image, the great stone structures of an empire slowly being reclaimed by the earth. The local people, perhaps unsure of how to maintain the hypocausts, went back to building with wood. The stone cities became ghost places, haunted by the memories of the giants who had built them. Today we see their skeletons, a wall running across a Northumberland hill, a foundation in a basement in London, quiet reminders that nothing lasts forever, but everything leaves a mark. As the Roman lights flickered out, the island didn't stay empty. The sea is a highway, and highways bring traffic. Across the North Sea, in the flat, watery lands of what is now Denmark and northern Germany, people were looking west. These were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. History often paints this as a violent invasion, a time of fire and sword, and while there were battles, for the most part this was a migration of farmers. They came in small, open wooden boats. Imagine the sensation of crossing the North Sea in an open boat, the cold spray, the grey waves, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. They were looking for land. The soil back home was poor and crowded, but the river valleys of Britain were rich and green. They landed on the gravel beaches of the east and south. They pulled their boats ashore, shaking the salt from their cloaks. They looked at the landscape, the Roman ruins standing silent on the hills, and they chose to settle in the valleys. They built differently. They didn't build in stone. They built in wood. They constructed great timber halls, high-roofed and thatched with straw. Imagine the interior of a Saxon hall on a winter's night. In the centre of the room is a long fire pit, the flames licking at the logs, sending sparks up into the smoky rafters. The walls are hung with woven tapestries to keep out the draughts. Men and women sit on benches, drinking ale from horn cups, their dogs sleeping at their feet. The air smells of wood smoke, roasted meat, and damp wool. It is a cosy, enclosed world. Outside, the forest is dark and dangerous, filled with monsters and elves in their imagination, but inside, There is light and warmth and the sound of a voice. This is the age of the storyteller, the scop. He stands by the fire, a harp in his hand, reciting poems that have been passed down for generations. Beowulf, the Battle of Maldon. Stories of heroes and dragons, told in a rhythmic, alliterative language that bumps and rolls like a cart on a track. This language, Old English, is the soil from which our modern tongue grows. It is a language of the earth. The Romans gave us words for law and science, but the Saxons gave us the words for home. House, woman, man, child, eat, sleep, earth, water. These are Saxon words. They are short, strong, and simple. When you speak to your family, when you talk about your feelings, you are usually speaking the language of these early farmers. They gave the land a new name too. The land of the Angles eventually shortened and softened into England. It happened almost by accident. There was no committee meeting to decide the brand name of the nation. It just grew like moss on a stone. They named their villages after their people. A place where a man named Tunner lived became Tunner's Tun, or town, Tunbridge. A place by a river crossing became a ford. A place in a valley became a ham, or home. Look at a map of England today, and you are reading a list of Saxon homesteads. Birmingham, Southampton, Oxford. It is a map of families who just wanted a quiet place to plough their fields and raise their cattle. They had no idea, those farmers in the year 600, that the names they gave their muddy little villages would one day appear on airport departure boards, on football jerseys, on passports carried to the other side of the world. They were just living their lives, day by day, season by season. Slowly, these small villages coalesced into kingdoms. The Kingdom of Wessex in the west, Mercia in the middle, Northumbria in the north. They jostled and argued, expanding and contracting like lungs breathing. Kings rose and fell, but the rhythm of the farming year continued unchanged. The seed was sown in spring, the harvest gathered in autumn, the winter endured by the fire. It was a quiet time, a time of local horizons, where the world ended at the nearest hill, but the horizon was about to get wider and sharper. We drift forward to the late 8th century. The air grows colder. We are standing on the coast of Northumbria, looking out at a grey, restless sea. The waves crash against the shore with a steady, soothing rhythm. Shh, crash, shh, crash. Out of the mist, shapes appear. They are beautiful and terrifying. Long, sleek ships sitting low in the water. They have high, curved prows carved into the shapes of dragons or serpents. The sails are square, striped in red and white, snapping in the wind. The oars dip and rise in perfect unison, like the legs of a swimming insect. The Vikings have arrived. The Vikings are the dramatic characters of our story. They burst onto the scene with energy and violence. They came from the fjords of Scandinavia, places of rock and ice, driven by a hunger for silver and land. At first they were raiders. They struck the monasteries, like Lindisfarne, taking the gold chalices and the jewelled book covers, leaving smoke and shock behind them. They were the wolf at the door, the nightmare in the dark. But history is rarely as simple as good guys and bad guys. As the years passed, the relationship changed. The Vikings looked at the green fields of England, just as the Saxons had done centuries before, and they thought, this looks like a good place to live. The raiders put down their axes and picked up ploughs. They brought their families. They settled in the north and east, in the area that became known as the Danelaw. They built cities. Jorvik, which we now call York, became a bustling metropolis of the north. Imagine walking through Viking York. It is not a place of war, but of trade. The streets are paved with timber planks. The air is thick with the smell of tar, of baking bread, of fish being smoked. Craftsmen sit in their workshops, carving combs out of deer antlers, turning wooden bowls on lathes, striking coins from silver. There is a blending happening here. The Saxon farmer and the Viking settler are neighbours. They trade, they argue, they intermarry. Their languages begin to mix. The Vikings gave us the words for the rugged, cutting things in life. Knife, scrap, hit, die. But they also gave us domestic words. Egg, steak, husband. They gave us the word window, from the Old Norse vindauga, the wind eye. Every time you check the weather through glass, you are using a Viking word. They gave us the Eski sounds. Sky, skin, skirt. The island absorbed them. This is one of the great secrets of British history. The island is like a sponge. It takes in the invader, the newcomer, and slowly, over generations, it makes them part of the landscape. The fierce warrior becomes the local grandfather. The dragon ship rots on the riverbank and is covered in wildflowers. The violent storm of the invasion passes, leaving behind a fertilized soil. The violet seas and the northern winds became part of the story, adding another layer of depth to the identity of the place. We move now to the most famous date in British history, a date that every schoolchild learns, even if they forget everything else. 1066. The King of England, Edward the Confessor, was a pious, quiet man. He spent more time praying than ruling. When he died, he left a vacuum. He had no children, and nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. Suddenly there were three men who wanted the crown. There was Harold Godwinson, the powerful English earl. There was the King of Norway, a giant of a man. And across the Channel, in Normandy, there was Duke William. The Normans were, interestingly enough, Vikings who had settled in France, Northmen. They had cut their hair, learned to drink wine, and started speaking French. But they still had that Viking ambition. William felt the crown was his. He gathered a massive fleet on the coast of France. Thousands of ships, thousands of horses, thousands of knights in chainmail. But he couldn't sail. The wind was blowing from the north. For weeks William stood on the cliffs of Normandy, staring at the weather vanes, frustrated, powerless. It is a very human moment. A great conqueror, an army ready to change the world, all held back because the breeze was blowing the wrong way. Finally, in late September, the wind shifted, the white sails filled, the fleet crossed the Channel in the night, the lanterns bobbing on the dark water like a city of fireflies. They landed on the south coast. The English army, led by Harold, had just marched all the way north to fight the Norwegians, and won, and now they had to march all the way back south. They were exhausted. They met the Normans near Hastings. They formed a shield wall on a ridge, a solid line of wooden shields, man to man, shoulder to shoulder. The battle raged all day. It was a grinding, shouting, shoving match. Arrows flew like hail. But as the sun began to set, turning the sky purple and red, the line broke. King Harold fell. The English resistance crumbled. William was now the conqueror. and England changed again. This time the change was vertical. The Normans became the new aristocracy. They took the land, they built castles, but not the wooden halls of the Saxons. They built in stone. Great towering keeps that still dominate the skyline today. The Tower of London, Rochester, Dover, these were statements of power. "We are here," the stone said, "and we are not moving." But the most fascinating change was in the language. For 300 years, the King of England did not speak English. The court spoke French. The law was in French. The aristocracy spoke French. But the common people, the 95%, kept speaking English. This created a wonderful duality that we still have today. Think about the food we eat. When the animal is living in the muddy field, looked after by the English peasant, it has a Germanic name: cow, sheep, pig. But when it arrives on the silver platter at the Norman lord's banquet, it gets a French name: beef, bœuf, mutton, mouton, pork, pork. We literally have a class system built into our vocabulary. You can imagine the scenes in the villages. The Norman soldier shouting orders in a language the locals barely understood. The locals nodding, smiling, and then going away and doing exactly what they wanted to do anyway. "You can conquer the island," a local wit might have said, "but good luck getting everyone to pronounce your vowels correctly." The English language survived. It simply stole the best words from the French, swallowed them whole, and kept growing. It became richer, more flexible, a language of poetry and law, of earth and sky. We let the centuries drift by now. The medieval world settles in. Knights in armour, monks in cloisters, peasants in the fields. The seasons turn. The Black Death comes and goes like a shadowed wing, leaving sorrow, but also changing the economy of the land. We move past the War of the Roses, a complex family squabble that bled the nobility dry, until we arrive in the 1500s. The air feels different here. We are in the Tudor era. It is a time of velvet and gold, of expanding horizons, and of a very large man with a very big problem: Henry VIII. We all know the image: the hands on hips, the broad shoulders, the beard. Henry is often remembered as a caricature, a man who collected wives like other people collect stamps. But his story is a reminder of how the personal problems of one man can reshape the soul of a nation. Henry had a simple desire. He wanted a son. He needed an heir to keep his dynasty safe. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had only given him a daughter. In the eyes of the time, this was a disaster. He wanted a new wife, Anne Boleyn. To get one, he needed a divorce. To get a divorce, he needed the Pope's permission. The Pope said no. Now, usually when a Pope says no to a king, the king grumbles and accepts it. But Henry was not a man who accepted no. He looked at the situation and made a decision that was breathtaking in its audacity. He decided that he, Henry, would simply become the head of the church in England. He fired the Pope. It was a political move, a legal trick to get a wedding ring on a finger. But the consequences were spiritual and physical. To cement his power, Henry dissolved the monasteries. For centuries, the landscape of Britain had been dotted with great abbeys, fountains, Tintern, Rievaulx. These were the powerhouses of prayer, but also of wealth. The monks owned vast lands, brewed beer, produced wool, and cared for the sick. Henry's men arrived with hammers and orders. They stripped the lead from the roofs. They smashed the stained glass. They drove the monks out. The great stone buildings were left to the elements. Rain fell into the naves where choirs had once sung. Weeds grew around the altars. Today, these ruins are some of the most beautiful, peaceful places in Britain. If you visit Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, you walk across manicured green grass, surrounded by soaring Gothic arches open to the sky. It is silent, save for the cooing of pigeons and the wind in the trees. It feels incredibly old and incredibly calm, but it is a calm born of violence. It is a reminder that history is often made by the collision of the personal and the political. Because a king fell in love with a young woman with dark eyes, the religious map of the island was redrawn. The Church of England was born, a middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism, a compromise that defines the British character to this day. We don't like extremes. We like a muddle, a fudge, a compromise that lets everyone get on with their dinner. It was a restless time, a time of fires and martyrs, of confusion for the ordinary person who just wanted to know which prayer to say. But through it all, the river of time kept flowing. The sun rose over the ruined abbeys, the grass grew over the fallen stones, and the island continued its slow journey into the modern world. As we pause here at the end of the 16th century, look back at the thread we have followed. From the silence of the ancient forests to the straight roads of the Romans, from the wooden halls of the Saxons to the dragon ships of the Vikings, from the stone castles of the Normans to the roofless abbeys of the Tudors. Each layer is distinct, yet each layer is part of the whole. The island is not one thing. It is everything it has ever been, all at once. And you, watching this now, are part of that story too. By remembering them, by picturing their lives, you are keeping their echoes alive. The past is not dead, it is just sleeping. And speaking of sleep, the hour is growing late. The timeline stretches out behind us, silver and shimmering in the moonlight. We have travelled a long way tonight, but there is always more to see. For now, however, let the images of green hills and grey stone fade gently from your mind. Let the sound of the Viking oars and the Roman sandals merge with the rhythm of your own breathing. The history is safe. The island is anchored fast. You can let go. Rest now. There is only the quiet and the dark and the peace of the ages. Here is the continuation of our journey, picking up where we left off in the late 16th century. We will drift through the next era of this island's story, letting the years unfold slowly and deliberately. We are standing now on the edge of the cliffs in Cornwall. It is the summer of 1588. The air is warm, smelling of sea salt and dried grass. Below us the English Channel churns, a restless expanse of grey and blue. For years the tension has been building, invisible but heavy, like the pressure in the air before a thunderstorm. And now, looking out toward the horizon, we see it break. The Spanish Armada. Even the name sounds immense. Armada. It rolls off the tongue with the weight of heavy timber and iron. King Philip of Spain, the most powerful man in the world, has sent his fleet to bring England back into the fold of the Catholic Church. Imagine the sheer scale of the sight, over 100 ships. But these are not ordinary ships. These are galleons, floating fortresses with high, ornate sterns painted in gold and red, towering masts and sails painted with religious crosses. They move up the channel in a crescent formation, a shape as disciplined and terrifying as a moon rising over the water. It is a slow-motion invasion, a wall of wood moving inexorably toward the white cliffs. England is the underdog here. Her ships are smaller, lower to the water. They look like terriers nipping at the heels of a bull. But they are faster, and they are manned by sailors who know every current, every sandbank, every shift of the wind in these waters. The beacons are lit. Picture a chain of fire leaping across the landscape, from a pile of wood on a Cornish cliff, to a hilltop in Devon, to the high ridges of the Downs, all the way to London. A line of orange sparks glowing in the twilight, signalling to the nation that the giant is at the door. For days the fleets skirmish. The sound of cannon fire rolls across the water like distant thunder, but the turning point comes not with a clash of swords, but with a drift of smoke. The Spanish fleet anchors off the coast of Calais, a tight floating city. In the dead of night, the English captains do something bold and desperate. They take 8 of their own ships, old vessels that have seen better days, and they fill them with pitch, tar, and gunpowder. They set them on fire and cut the ropes. Close your eyes and imagine the visual: the dark, ink-black sea, the silence of the waiting fleets, and then 8 glowing points of light, growing brighter, hotter, drifting on the tide toward the Spanish line. The panic is immediate. The Spanish captains cut their anchors. The disciplined crescent breaks apart, scattering into the night like a flock of birds startled by a gunshot. And then nature takes over. The British weather, a character in this story as important as any king or queen, steps onto the stage. The wind shifts. A gale blows down from the North Sea, a fierce, howling storm that the English would later call the Protestant wind. It catches the great Spanish galleons, helpless without their anchors, and drives them north. They are pushed up the east coast of England, around the wild, rocky tip of Scotland, and down the treacherous west coast of Ireland. The mighty fleet is battered by waves as high as cathedral walls. Many are wrecked on the jagged rocks. For the people watching from the English coast, the threat simply dissolves into the mist. The giant was not slain by a hero with a sword, but by ingenuity and the wind. It left the island with a profound sense of relief, a feeling that perhaps they were protected by something greater than themselves. The lanterns on the masts of the surviving English ships bobbed gently in the harbour. The storm passed, the silence returning to the channel. A small island had faced a giant, and the island was still standing. This victory ushered in a period that glows in the history books with a warm, golden light, the Elizabethan age. Queen Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, sat on the throne for 45 years. It was a time of stability after the chaos of her father's reign. She was a master of image, painting herself as the Virgin Queen, married only to her country. Picture the court of Elizabeth. It is a world of sensory overload. The rustle of heavy silk, the stiffness of starched ruffs that frame the face like a plate, the gleam of pearls, thousands of pearls sewn into dresses, worn in hair, draped around necks. It was a time of exploration, of Francis Drake sailing around the world, bringing back tales of lands where the sun never set. But the true jewel of this age wasn't gold, It was words. In a rough, noisy part of London called Southwark, on the south bank of the Thames, stood the Globe Theatre. It was an open-air wooden O, smelling of sawdust, hazelnuts, and the unwashed bodies of the groundlings who paid a penny to stand in the yard. And there, on a simple stage with barely any scenery, the plays of William Shakespeare were performed. Just listen to the rhythm of that time. The English language was exploding. Shakespeare invented hundreds of words we still use: bedroom, lonely, kissing, gossip. He took the messy, flexible language of the Anglo-Saxons and the elegant language of the Normans and forged them into poetry that captured the human soul. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, to be or not to be? It is soothing to think that in a world of plague and politics, people stood together in the afternoon sun and listened to stories about love, jealousy, and magic. It was a cultural flowering, a garden blooming in the middle of a rocky history. But all seasons must end. Elizabeth grew old. The makeup grew thicker to hide the wrinkles, the red wigs more elaborate. She had no children. The old question, the one that had haunted her father, returned. Who comes next? As she lay dying in 1603, the court held its breath. The answer, it turned out, lay to the north. James VI of Scotland. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the woman Elizabeth had executed. It is one of history's ironies. James was invited to take the throne. A messenger rode north, galloping day and night, covering the distance from London to Edinburgh in record time. He knelt before James and called him King of England. James rode south. It was a peaceful invasion. No armies, just a king and his retinue moving from one capital to another. As he crossed the border, something profound happened. The debatable lands, those lawless miles where reavers and cattle thieves had fought for centuries, became simply the middle of a kingdom. James I of England and VI of Scotland, 2 crowns on one head. The countries were still separate. They had their own laws, their own parliaments, their own churches, but they were united in person. It was the planting of a seed. The idea of a Great Britain, a united Ireland, began to take root in the mind of the king. He commissioned a new translation of the Bible, the King James Version. Majestic, poetic, rhythmic, its cadences would seep into the English consciousness, shaping the way people spoke and prayed for centuries. A quiet legacy of a king who preferred books to battles. While James was settling into his new palace in London, drinking sweet wine and lecturing his courtiers, a group of much more desperate people was staring at a different horizon, the Atlantic Ocean. In 1607, 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, set sail for the New World. Imagine the journey. Months of grey waves, of cramped quarters, of salt beef and stale water. They were heading for Virginia. They were dreaming of gold. They expected to walk onto the beach and find nuggets lying in the sand, just as the Spanish had in the south. They landed on a marshy peninsula and named it Jamestown. It was, to put it mildly, a mistake. The water was brackish and salty. The air hummed with clouds of mosquitoes carrying malaria. And there was no gold, not a flake. The early years of Jamestown are a story of endurance, the starving time, men in heavy wool doublets sweating in the humid American summer, dying of fever, looking out at the endless woods and wondering why they had left England. They were lonely, isolated specks on the edge of a vast, unknown continent. They nearly gave up. They had packed the ships to leave when a supply fleet appeared on the horizon, convincing them to stay. And then the pivot. A man named John Rolfe began to experiment with a plant the locals used, tobacco. It wasn't the gold they wanted, but it turned out to be the gold they needed. The sotweed, as the king called it, he hated smoking, grew incredibly well in the Virginia soil. It was addictive, it was portable, and Europe couldn't get enough of it. Suddenly, the colony had a purpose. Fields of green leaves stretched out under the hot sun. Ships arrived, not just with supplies, but with empty holds ready to be filled with hogsheads of cured tobacco. The smell of the smoke saved the colony. It's a strange, sleepy thought that the foundation of the English-speaking presence in North America was built on a leaf that people set on fire and inhaled. But history is often made of such small, unexpected things. Those early settlers, coughing in the smoke of their drying barns, were unaware that they were laying the first stones of a new world, a relationship that would eventually eclipse the mother country itself. Back in England, the smoke was of a different kind. The gunpowder plot of 1605 had failed. Guy Fawkes caught in the cellar beneath Parliament, but a slower fuse was burning. We moved to the reign of Charles I, James's son. Charles was a man of high taste. He loved art. He bought paintings by Titian and Rubens. He was small, dignified, and utterly convinced that he answered to no one but God. This was the divine right of kings. I am the king, he effectively said, so do not ask me to explain myself. But Parliament, sitting on the wooden benches in Westminster, felt differently. They were practical men, merchants and landowners. They controlled the money. They believed the king should govern with them, not over them. The argument went on for years. It was a slow brewing of conflict, like tea steeping too long until it becomes bitter. Arguments over taxes, over religion, over power. Finally, in 1642, the words ran out. The king raised his standard at Nottingham. The Civil War began. It is a tragedy to think of this island, so small and contained, tearing itself apart. It wasn't a war of foreign invaders, it was a war of neighbours. The Cavaliers, with their long hair and loyalty to the king, against the Roundheads, with their cropped hair and loyalty to Parliament. Families were divided. A father might ride for the king, while his son rode for Cromwell. Battles were fought in the sheep fields and the village greens, Edgehill, Marston Moor, Naseby. The sound of musket fire popping in the damp air, the clash of pike against armour. But it wasn't a war of total destruction. It was a war of manoeuvre. And slowly the grim efficiency of Parliament's new model army, led by Oliver Cromwell, ground the royalists down. The war ended with the king in captivity, and then the unthinkable happened. The king was put on trial. A king tried by his own people. It was unheard of. He refused to even recognise the court, sitting in his chair with his hat on, silent and defiant. They sentenced him to death. On a freezing January day in 1649, Charles I stepped out of a window of the banqueting house in London, a building whose ceiling was painted by his favourite artist, Rubens, onto a scaffold. He wore 2 shirts so he wouldn't shiver from the cold, lest the crowd think he was trembling with fear. The axe fell. A groan went up from the crowd, not a cheer, but a groan, a collective intake of breath. They had killed the Lord's anointed. For the next 11 years, the island was a republic, a commonwealth. Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector. It was a strange grey time. The theatres were closed. The maypoles were cut down. Christmas was effectively banned. No mince pies, no celebrations. It was a time of moral strictness. Cromwell was a brilliant general, but a joyless ruler. When Cromwell died, the country looked at itself in the mirror and realised it missed the colour. It missed the tradition. It missed the king. In 1660, the late king's son was invited back from exile. Charles II rode into London on his birthday, amidst flowers and cheering crowds. The Restoration. The theatres reopened. The ale flowed. The country collectively shrugged, said, "Well, that was a weird experiment," and went back to what it knew. It is a very British reaction. Radicalism followed by a polite return to the queue. But the question of who was really in charge, king or parliament, wasn't fully settled. It would take one more push. Charles II was the merry monarch, but his brother James II, who took the throne next, was not merry at all. He was serious, and he was Catholic. Now, in the late 17th century, religion was politics. A Catholic king looking to expand his power made the Protestant establishment very nervous. They remembered the fires of the past. They looked across the Channel at France, where the king ruled with absolute power, and they shuddered. So the leading figures of the country did something quietly revolutionary. They wrote a letter. They sent it to William of Orange, a Dutch prince. William was a Protestant, and he was married to James's daughter Mary. The letter was essentially a polite invitation. "Dear William, things are getting a bit awkward here. Would you mind bringing an army over and taking the throne? We'll make sure the gate is unlocked." In 1688, William landed at Torbay. It was an invasion, certainly. He brought thousands of Dutch soldiers, but it was the strangest invasion in history. As he marched toward London, no one fought him. James's army simply melted away. His generals switched sides. Even his other daughter, Anne, left him. James, isolated and panicking, tried to flee. In a moment of symbolic pettiness, he took the great seal of the realm, the heavy stamp used to approve laws, and threw it into the River Thames, as if to say, "If I can't run the country, no one can." He took a boat to France and never returned. William and Mary were offered the throne as joint monarchs, but there was a catch. Parliament presented them with a document, the Bill of Rights. It was a list of rules. The king could not suspend laws. The king could not levy taxes without Parliament. The king could not keep a standing army in peacetime without permission. William signed, and in that quiet moment the modern world was born. The glorious revolution. It wasn't glorious because of a great battle. It was glorious because hardly anyone died. It was a revolution of paperwork. It established that the true power in the land was the law, made by the representatives of the people, not the whim of a monarch. It was a constitutional shift as gentle and inexorable as the turning of the tide. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, The island was looking more stable, but there was still a line on the map, the border between England and Scotland. Since 1603 they had shared a king, but they were still two countries, two parliaments, two economies, and Scotland's economy was in trouble. In the 1690s, Scotland had tried to launch its own colonial empire. They devised a plan to build a colony in Panama called the Darien Scheme. They poured a huge percentage of the nation's wealth into it. It was a disaster. The terrain was impossible. The disease was rampant, and the Spanish were hostile. The colony failed. Scotland was effectively bankrupt. England, meanwhile, was fighting wars with France and worried that Scotland might ally with the enemy. They wanted security. Scotland wanted access to England's colonial markets to recover its money. So the deal was done. The Act of Union of 1707. It was a marriage of convenience, not romance. The Scottish politicians who signed it were called a parcel of rogues by the poet Robert Burns. There were riots in Edinburgh, but on paper the two kingdoms dissolved and were reborn as one, the Kingdom of Great Britain. The flags were combined, the Cross of St. George and the Cross of St. Andrew, creating the Union Jack. The parliaments merged in Westminster. It is important to acknowledge that this wasn't a seamless blend. There was bitterness. There were memories of violence, like the massacre of Glencoe a few years earlier, where government soldiers had killed members of the MacDonald clan in the snow, a dark stain that lingered in the Highland memory. But practically the island began to function as a single unit. The internal trade barriers came down. A merchant in Glasgow could trade freely with a merchant in Bristol. The island became a single economic engine, revving up for the century to come. And what an engine it was becoming. While the politicians were signing treaties, the merchants were building a web. Let us drift back to London, to a nondescript building on Leadenhall Street, the headquarters of the East India Company. It had started back in Elizabeth's time as a simple group of traders pooling their money to buy spices, pepper, nutmeg, cloves. These were the treasures of the East, worth their weight in gold. But over the 17th and 18th centuries, the company grew into something unique. It wasn't just a business, it was a power. Imagine the warehouses in London. The air inside is thick with exotic scents, crates of tea from China, the leaves that would become the national fuel of Britain, bales of calico and silk from India, porcelain that rang like a bell when you tapped it. The company built forts on the coast of India, Madras, Bombay, Calcutta. They hired their own armies. They signed treaties with Nawabs and Maharajas. Slowly the focus shifted from trade to territory. In the rich province of Bengal, the company became the effective ruler. This is a complex part of the story. It is easy to be seduced by the romance of the tall ships and the smell of spices. But we must be honest, the company was a ruthless machine for profit. When famine struck Bengal in 1770, the company continued to collect taxes while millions starved. It is a heavy, sombre note in our quiet history. The wealth that built the elegant country houses of England often came from the hard labour and suffering of people thousands of miles away. The empire at this stage wasn't a grand government project. It was a corporate web. A clerk in London dipped his quill in ink and wrote a number in a ledger, and the effects were felt in a village in the Ganges Delta. The world was shrinking. The global economy was being born, stitched together by the sea lanes patrolled by British ships. As we reach the middle of the 18th century, pause for a moment and look at the picture we have painted. The small island, once a foggy outpost of Rome, once a patchwork of Saxon farms, once a victim of Viking raids, has transformed. It has weathered the storms of religious division. It has executed a king and invited another back. It has united its two ancient halves into one kingdom. And now it is reaching its long arms out across the oceans, grasping the Americas with one hand and India with the other. It is a position of immense potential and immense danger. The quiet, rain-swept island is now a player on the world stage. The timeline stretching behind us is getting crowded with events, but the rhythm remains the same. The sun rises, the tide turns, the seasons change. The sheep still graze on the hills around the Roman ruins, indifferent to the price of tea in China or the debates in Parliament. There is a comfort in that indifference. The land endures. The stories pile up, layer upon layer, but the foundation holds. We can rest here in the middle of the 18th century with the smell of tobacco and tea in the air, the sound of the printing press, and the loom beginning to quicken, waiting for the next chapter of the night. The ships are in the harbour, the sails are furled, the lanterns are lit, the history is safe. You can drift now, floating on the calm waters of time, knowing that the storm has passed and the morning is still far away. Sleep well. We drift now across the vast grey expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. We are leaving the wharves of London and the boardrooms of the East India Company, and we are following the trade winds west. The year is moving into the late 1700s. The ocean is wide, a formidable barrier of wind and wave that takes weeks to cross. And on the other side, something is changing. The American colonies, Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York. For a century and a half they had been the children of the empire, distant, perhaps a little unruly, but family nonetheless. They spoke English. They drank tea. They read the King James Bible. But time and distance have a way of altering things. The people living in Boston or Philadelphia still called themselves Englishmen, but they felt different. They breathed different air. They walked through forests that were vaster and older than anything in Kent or Surrey. They had grown used to managing their own affairs, solving their own problems on the edge of the wilderness. In London, the government looked at a map and saw subjects who should pay for the protection of the crown. In America, the colonists looked at their ledgers and saw taxes being demanded by a parliament they had never seen, in a city they might never visit. It wasn't a sudden explosion of anger. It was a slow, simmering sense of unfairness. A stamp tax on legal papers, a duty on tea. Small things, really, in the grand scheme of history, but they were symbols. No taxation without representation. It was a slogan that was discussed in quiet voices in coffee houses, then in louder voices in town halls, until it became a shout. We know how this chapter ends. The tea chests floating in Boston Harbour, the tea turning the cold salt water brown, a tragic waste of a good brew, as any Briton might sigh. The skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, the Declaration of Independence. The war that followed was a messy, confused affair for the British. Their armies, so disciplined on the battlefields of Europe, found themselves chasing shadows in the American woods. It was expensive, it was unpopular, and it was far away. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, acknowledging the United States as a free and independent nation, it was a moment of profound shock for the British establishment. They had lost the jewel of the West. They had lost their kin. But here is where the story takes a turn that is strangely calming. You might expect the empire to collapse, for the island to turn inward and sulk, but it didn't. There was a collective shrug. The king and his ministers looked at the map, saw that the door to the west was closed, and simply turned their heads. Very well, the mood seemed to be. If we cannot go west, we shall go east and south. It was a pivot, a resilience born of pragmatism. The loss of America didn't end the British Empire. In a strange way, it liberated it to become something else. It forced the island to look at the rest of the globe with new eyes. The ships in the harbour turned their prows toward the Indian Ocean, toward the Pacific, toward the unknown. It is a reminder that in history, as in life, what looks like an ending is often just the clearing of the stage for the next act. One of the immediate problems created by the loss of America was a very practical one. For years, Britain had sent its convicts, people who had stolen a loaf of bread, or poached a rabbit, or forged a cheque, across the Atlantic to work in the colonies. Now the United States said, no more. The prisons in England began to overflow. Old warships, their masts removed, were moored in the Thames and filled with prisoners. It was a temporary solution that couldn't last. The government needed a place far away, a place from which there was no return. They pulled out the charts from Captain James Cook's voyages a few years earlier. He had reported a vast land in the Southern Ocean, Terra Australis. In 1787, the first fleet assembled, 11 small ships. They were about to attempt something that feels almost like a moon landing for the 18th century. They were going to sail 15,000 miles to the other side of the planet, to a land they knew almost nothing about, with 700 convicts and a few hundred Marines. Imagine the journey, 8 months at sea, the heat of the equator, the storms of the Southern Ocean, the endless monotony of the horizon, and then the arrival. January 1788. They sailed into Botany Bay, and then around the corner into one of the finest natural harbours in the world, Sydney Cove. To the eyes of those London pickpockets and rural poachers, this new world must have looked like an alien planet. The light was different, harder, brighter. The trees didn't lose their leaves in winter. They shed their bark. The air smelled of eucalyptus, a sharp medicinal scent that hung over the blue mountains. Strange animals hopped on powerful back legs. Birds, cockatoos and lorikeets, screeched in colours of sulphur yellow and crimson red, mocking the polite songbirds of home. The early years were a struggle for survival. The soil was sandy and confusing to English farmers. The seasons were upside down. Christmas came in the middle of a scorching summer. They faced starvation. They faced the loneliness of being at the absolute edge of the known world. If they got into trouble, the nearest help was a year away. But slowly, painfully, a society began to form. The convicts served their 7 or 14 years. They were given tickets of leave. They built wattle and daub huts. They planted crops that finally took root. They married. They had children who had never seen England, children who grew up tall and strong in the sunshine, who spoke with a new accent, a flattening of the vowels, a slow drawl suited to the heat. It is a testament to the stubborn adaptability of people. You can take a group of exiles, drop them on a strange coast, and within a generation they will have built a town, a church, a pub, and a cricket pitch. Australia began not with a grand vision of glory, but with the quiet, desperate work of survival. It grew from the bottom up, improvised and rough, eventually becoming a proud and thriving nation. It reminds us that history's grandest movements often start with improvisation and necessity rather than clear vision. Back in the Northern Hemisphere, the ground was beginning to vibrate. We are moving into the 19th century now, the 1800s, and the rhythm of the island is changing. For thousands of years, the background noise of Britain had been organic. The wind in the trees, the rushing of water in the river, the clip-clop of horses, the lowing of cattle. Now a new sound was rising, the hiss of steam, the rhythmic clank, clank, clank of iron on iron, the roar of the furnace. The Industrial Revolution. It happened here first. It happened because the island was sitting on a bed of coal and iron. It happened because of a unique combination of science, capital, and a shortage of wood. Men like James Watt and George Stephenson began to tinker with fire and water. They built engines that breathed steam. Suddenly, the world began to speed up. Factories sprang up in the north of England. Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, Newcastle, great red brick cathedrals of industry. Chimneys rose like a forest of brick trees, pumping smoke into the sky, turning the clouds grey. Inside, the power looms clattered with a deafening noise, spinning cotton from America and wool from Australia into cloth that would clothe the world. But the biggest change, the one that altered the feeling of life itself, was the railway. Before the train, the world was large. To travel from London to Edinburgh took weeks of uncomfortable bouncing in a horse-drawn carriage. Most people lived and died within 10 miles of where they were born. Their world was their village. Then the iron rails were laid, straight lines cutting through the gentle curves of the countryside. Viaducts of brick soaring over valleys, tunnels boring through hills, and the steam locomotives, huffing and puffing, pulling carriages of people at speeds that seemed terrifying, 20, 30, 40 miles an hour. The world shrank. You could read the Times in London at breakfast and be in Birmingham for a late lunch. The concept of time itself had to change. Before trains, every town kept its own local time based on the sun. Noon in Bristol was 10 minutes later than noon in London. But you can't run a railway schedule on sun time. So, railway time was invented. Standardized time. The clocks of the nation were synchronized. The island began to tick to a single mechanical beat. Amidst this transformation, a political union took place. In 1801, the Kingdom of Ireland was formally merged with Great Britain to create the United Kingdom. It was a decision driven by fear of rebellion and French invasion, and it created a superstate. The island of Ireland, with its green fields and complex history, was now legally part of the same structure as the industrial powerhouse of England. It was a union that would prove to be both powerful and deeply strained, a marriage that was never quite settled. But looking at it from a distance, the United Kingdom in the early 19th century was becoming a titan. It was the workshop of the world. If you bought a knife, a coat, a pin, or a steam engine anywhere on earth, chances were it was made in a smoky valley in northern England. The heartbeat of the island was the piston, driving the empire forward with relentless mechanical force. But even titans have enemies. And across the English Channel, the old rival was back, stronger than ever. France, and not just France, but Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had conquered Europe. He was a military genius, moving armies like chess pieces, redrawing the map of the continent. But there was one thing he could not control: the sea. Between Napoleon and the conquest of Britain lay the English Channel, and guarding that channel was the Royal Navy. We must pause here to appreciate the aesthetic of the age of sail. These ships, the wooden walls of England, were things of terrifying beauty. Mountains of white canvas towering over hulls of oak, networks of rope and rigging so complex they looked like spider webs. They were commanded by men who had lived at sea since they were children. In 1805, the threat of invasion was real. Napoleon had gathered an army on the French coast. He just needed his fleet to clear the channel for a few days. The fleets met off the southwest coast of Spain, near a cape called Trafalgar. It is a battle that has passed into legend, but let's view it quietly. The slow approach of the ships in the light airs. The British fleet, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson in the HMS Victory, sailing in two parallel columns directly at the French and Spanish line. It was a risky, unorthodox manoeuvre. Nelson wanted a decisive battle, not a skirmish. As the ships closed in, Nelson sent a signal, flags fluttering up the halyards. England expects that every man will do his duty. The battle was a chaotic, thundering storm of splintering wood and cannon smoke. At close quarters, the ships hammered each other, but the British gunners were faster, better drilled. They fired 3 shots for every one of the enemy. In the heat of the battle, Nelson was pacing the deck, his medals glinting in the sun. A sniper from a French ship saw him. A shot rang out. Nelson fell. He was carried below decks, into the dark, swaying cockpit of the ship. He died knowing that he had won. The French and Spanish fleets were annihilated. Britain was safe. It was a moment of national sorrow and national triumph mixed together. Trafalgar didn't just win a war, it defined the next century. For the next 100 years, the Pax Britannica, no other nation dared to challenge Britain at sea. The Royal Navy became the police force of the global ocean. They chased pirates. They mapped the coastlines. They protected the merchant ships that carried the wealth of the world. And as the century progressed, the technology changed. The wooden ships gave way to iron. The sails gave way to steam. And a new invention, the telegraph, began to stitch the world together. Cables were laid under the Atlantic, under the Indian Ocean. A message that once took months to travel from London to Bombay now took minutes. The world was becoming a single nervous system, and London was the brain. The British Empire wasn't just a collection of lands, it was a network of information and trade, a global web held together by steamships and copper wires. But we must not let the glamour of the tall ships and the steam engines blind us. The 19th century was the height of the empire, but the higher the sun, the darker the shadows. We must walk now through the quieter, sadder valleys of this history. We must look at the cost. In the 1840s, a silence fell over the fields of Ireland. The potato crop, the staple food for millions of the rural poor, turned black and rotten in the ground. A fungus, Phytophthora infestans, had arrived, the Great Famine, and Gorta more. It is difficult to find calm words for such suffering. People starving in their cottages, families walking the roads, looking for food and finding none. 1 million people died, another million fled, packing on to coffin ships to sail to America, Liverpool, or Australia. The British government in London failed. They were bound by rigid economic theories that said the market would sort it out, that charity would make people lazy. They continued to export grain from Ireland while the people starved. It was a failure of empathy, a failure of imagination, and a moral stain that has never washed away. It left a legacy of bitterness in Ireland that would shape the politics of the island for generations. In India, too, the shadows lengthened. In 1857, the simmering resentment against the rule of the East India Company boiled over. It was sparked by a rumour that the new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, offending both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. But the roots went deeper. It was a reaction to the arrogance of a foreign power changing the culture and laws of an ancient civilization. The rebellion was violent, and the British response was brutal. When the dust settled, the East India Company was dissolved. The British Crown took direct control. Queen Victoria became the Empress of India. The relationship became more formal, more distant. The British built railways and courts and universities in India, but they also built walls of social exclusion. They ruled as a separate caste, convincing themselves they were bringing civilization, while often remaining blind to the culture they were dominating. And at the end of the century, the Boer War in South Africa, a messy, ugly conflict against Dutch settlers. It dragged on for years. The British Army, expecting an easy victory, was humiliated by guerrilla tactics. They resorted to burning farms and herding civilians into concentration camps, a term that would take on an even darker meaning later in the 20th century. These are the shadows. The empire was not a fairy tale. It was a human construct, full of grandeur and greed, achievement and atrocity. We acknowledge these things tonight not to disturb our rest, but to see the picture clearly. True peace comes from understanding the whole story, the light and the dark together. And then the 20th century arrived, and the world broke. We approached the year 1914. The summer was beautiful, the harvests were good, but in Sarajevo an archduke was shot, and the complex web of alliances dragged the great powers of Europe into the abyss. World War I. The boys marched away with smiles. They thought it would be an adventure. They thought it would be over by Christmas. But the war didn't end at Christmas. It dug itself into the ground. The trenches. Imagine the landscape of the Western Front. A scar across the face of Europe. Mud, barbed wire, the smell of cordite, and the silence, the terrible, waiting silence before the whistle blew and the men climbed over the top. It was a war of industrial slaughter. The machine gun, the heavy artillery, the poison gas. A generation of young men, the lost generation, was wiped out. The village cricket teams, the factory shifts, the university classes. They died in the mud of the Somme and Passchendaele. When the guns finally fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, there was no great cheer. There was just a numbness, a profound exhaustion. The island was grieving. In every town and village, a stone cross was erected, carved with the names of the fallen. They are still there, in the centre of the quiet villages, covered in lichen. The list of names often heartbreakingly long for such small places. The years between the wars, the 20s and 30s, feel like a pause, a time of jazz, of flappers, of trying to forget. But the shadow was returning. The radio broadcasts became grave again. Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Britain honoured its promise. World War II began. This time, the war didn't stay in the fields of France. It came to the streets of London. The Blitz. For months, the Luftwaffe bombed the British cities. Night after night, the sirens wailed, a rising and falling note that chilled the blood. But the response of the people became a defining myth of the nation. They didn't panic. They blacked out their windows. They went down into the Anderson shelters in the gardens or the tube stations deep underground. They brought thermoses of tea and blankets. They sang songs. When the all clear sounded in the morning, they emerged to find their streets changed, houses turned to rubble, and then they swept up the glass, they put the kettle on, and they went to work. Keep calm and carry on. It was a quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken. Britain stood alone in Europe for a year, a small island shielding the flame of democracy against a hurricane of tyranny. Eventually, allies joined. The Americans, the Russians. The tide turned. D-Day, the push to Berlin. Victory in 1945 was sweet. The street parties, the bunting, the king waving from the balcony. But it was a hollow victory. Britain was bankrupt. The cities were scarred. The people were tired. Tired of rationing, tired of death, tired of struggle. And the empire, that vast global web, began to dissolve. It wasn't wrested away in a great defeat. It just slipped away, like sand through fingers. The will to rule was gone, and the right of peoples to rule themselves could no longer be denied. India, the jewel, became independent in 1947. The Union Jack came down in New Delhi. Then followed the African nations, the Caribbean islands, the outposts in the east. One by one, the red on the map changed colour. It was a rapid, breathtaking shrinking. In the span of a single lifetime, a man could have watched Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, celebrating the greatest empire in history, and then watched the handover of Hong Kong, marking its end. But it wasn't an end to connection. The Commonwealth was formed, a voluntary club of nations, united by history, language, and cricket, a softer, looser echo of what had come before. And so we arrive at the modern island. The post-war years were a time of reinvention. The rubble was cleared, concrete tower blocks replaced the Victorian terraces, and a new idea was born: the welfare state, the National Health Service, the idea that in a civilised country, no one should be afraid of getting sick because they couldn't afford a doctor. It became a new source of national pride, a gentler kind of patriotism. New faces arrived. The ship Empire Windrush docked in 1948, carrying people from the Caribbean who had been invited to help rebuild the mother country. They were followed by people from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. At first, there was friction. The weather was cold, and the welcome was sometimes colder. But slowly, the culture shifted. The smell of boiling cabbage and Sunday roast was joined by the scent of curry, ginger, and jerk chicken. The music changed. The rhythm of the streets changed. Britain became a multicultural tapestry, woven with threads from all over the world. The decades rolled by, the swinging 60s, the strife of the 70s, the boom of the 80s. The final colony, Hong Kong, was returned to China in 1997. The rain fell on the harbour as the royal yacht sailed away. It felt like the closing of a book. But books have sequels. The internal map of the island shifted. Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland regained their own voices with devolved parliaments. The Good Friday Agreement brought a fragile, precious peace to Northern Ireland, ending decades of violence. Then, the great debate about Europe. For 40 years, the island had been part of the European Union. But the island mentality is a deep thing. The sense of being apart, of looking to the open sea rather than the continent, never quite went away. The Brexit vote in 2016 was a moment of deep division, a family argument about identity. Who are we? The island asked. Are we European? Are we global? Are we just ourselves? The question hangs in the air, unanswered. But that is okay. History isn't a math problem to be solved. It is a song to be sung, and the song changes key. And that brings us to now, to this moment, to you, listening in the dark. The history of this island is not a solid block of stone. It is a river. It flows and twists. It speeds up and slows down. It is the story of Romans building roads, of Saxons ploughing fields, of Vikings sailing ships, of Normans building castles. It is the story of kings and queens, but also of weavers and miners, of poets and nurses. It is a story of a landscape that absorbs everything. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the island settling down for the night. Imagine the lights of London blinking like a galaxy of stars, the great city finally quieting down. Imagine the dark, silent shapes of the mountains in Wales. Imagine the wind sweeping over the heather in the Scottish Highlands, where the deer are sleeping in the glens. Imagine the waves of the Atlantic, the North Sea, and the Channel, gently lapping against the shore, the white cliffs of Dover, the granite rocks of Cornwall, the sandy beaches of Norfolk. Were all those centuries, all those lives. They have all led to this quiet moment. The history is safe. It has already happened. The tragedies and the triumphs are all recorded, filed away in the archives of time. There is nothing for you to solve tonight. You can let the timeline roll up. You can let the map fade. The past is a soft pillow, a foundation upon which the present rests. The island has survived storms, invasions, plagues, and wars, and it is still there, green and grey in the ocean. It will be there tomorrow. If you are still here, please leave a soft like or comment and subscribe. But for now, the story is paused. Let the long tale of Britain drift away. Let the dates and the names dissolve into a comfortable haze. The island is sleeping now, and soon you will be too. Sleep well. Drift on the river of time. Good night.